Spotify is one of the only companies that's allowing their employees to continue to work remote in the tech space. What's going on here? We're going to talk about effective leadership on today's podcast and why so many tech companies, which should be leveraging technology, are sending their employees back to work, and why Spotify is doing something different. Hey, I'm the host of the Good Advice Podcast. My name's Blake Benz, and thank you for joining our show today. Whether you're a first-time listener or a long-time listener, we're going to give you the good advice and the practical advice, the things that actually work to help you grow and scale your business and to simply do business better. Before we dive into talking about Spotify today, we have a word from one of the amazing businesses that sponsors the podcast. We'll be right back soon. Do you ever feel like your payment processor is robbing you blind? For some of us, it's not blind. We look at the amount of money that's going to our payment processor month after month, and a lot of times we ask ourselves, is there a better way? I'm making good money, yet so much of it isn't actually ending up in my pocket. In the world of payment processing, in many cases, it's a cashless world, so you have to have a payment processor you can really trust. I personally am a big fan of Brad Norwood, who's the owner of PrimePaymentsUSA.com. Brad's a business owner himself. He knows all the challenges that come with running a business. More importantly, he knows the value of an individual customer. See, some of these bigger businesses, they're all about scale. They're all about bringing in as many customers as possible. But do they know your name? Do they know your business? Do they know what's important to you? In many cases, the answer is no. And in worst cases, they're just looking to get as much money from every transaction that you work hard for, which really doesn't feel too good. So you got to reach out to Brad Norwood today and understand how he's doing business and why it can save you money month after month. More importantly, you might even ask him about his zero-fee payment processing that he's offering to a select few of people. Go to PrimePaymentsUSA.com and start putting the money that you worked hard for back into your pocket. All right, I loved this headline that popped up this week. In fact, let me pull up. There's a few headlines that I want to get out open for today's episode. Now, this broke the news 5 days ago. So this would have been Thursday of last week. The headline reads, "Our employees are not children." This is a quote from the head of HR from Spotify. And then the headline continues, "Spotify will continue to allow remote working." Now, what's interesting about Spotify is that they are one of few tech companies that is continuing to embrace remote work. Now, if you've been following the employment world over the last few years, naturally, we had COVID, which caused a massive uptick in employees looking for remote opportunities. We saw a multitude of businesses that really cheered and talked about the value of remote work. And then what we've seen over the last year or so is these same businesses, in fact, not necessarily going backwards on what they said, but who have been basically publicized their new policies of, we want people back in the office. We want people to come back to work. We want people back in these, our headquarters or our office spaces or what have you. And, there's quite a bit to unpack here. I mean, some theories around businesses that have quite a bit of their, they've spent millions of dollars in state-of-the-art buildings and they can't just be empty. But all that to say, whatever the reason for it, we're going to dive into this a little bit today and talk about what Spotify is understanding and what many of these other businesses are simply not getting. So I mentioned Spotify is one of the few tech businesses that is promoting remote work. And let me actually pull up a couple of things that I've talked about on the podcast before. If I was smarter, I would have pulled these things up before I hit record today. So this is something pretty interesting to me. This was back in August of 2023. Zoom essentially told their employees, hey, remote work is ending. You need to come back to the office. Now, Zoom was already a pretty interesting business that was doing this because I thought, this is the brand that you would think would be all in on remote work. In fact, Zoom really saw its massive growth during the COVID time. Is it going to go down like that? But during the time of COVID. And interestingly enough, we saw a lot of memes and jokes about Zooming and people having Zoom exhaustion because it had become so much of a norm. In fact, I think about like family members who maybe I never would have expected to be on a Zoom call together. I remember my wife and our family getting on a big Zoom call to say, "Hey, what's going on?" And so you may have actually yourself been on something like that. But all this to say, you would think Zoom would be the one company that would be a massive proponent of remote work. And yet in 2023, they said, hey, you know what? We're going to end remote work. We're going to bring people back to the office. And they are not the only one. Let's pull up a couple other ones here. Dell Computers in February of this past year ended their remote work policy. And the funny thing about Dell was Dell actually, they allowed their employees to stay hybrid or remote, but if they did so, they would no longer be eligible for promotions. And what was thought was that um, this would incentivize people to come back to the office. Interestingly enough, the majority of people who were remote turned down, they opted out of those promotion opportunities and basically said, yeah, we'd prefer to work from home and not have to go back to the office. So you have Zoom, you have Dell, you have Amazon, you have a number of companies. Walmart made national news, I guess it was last month, where they said that people would have to come back to the corporate office, which, by the way, this wasn't actually living here in Northwest Arkansas. This actually is a new initiative. I've had many friends over the last couple of years who've been asked to come back to in-office work and remove to essentially end their remote positions. But this news story is really interesting to me. And actually, let's actually look at a couple things here. So Dell stock prices are down from $140 in May, $180 in May, and they are down to $120 in the past, what is that, 6 months? Let's look at Zoom. Let's look at 2023. Zoom stock prices have dropped. Man, their stock prices was crazy. $560 a share in 2020, down to $65 as of now. Meanwhile, let's look at Spotify. Spotify is the highest it has ever been in the history of the company as of today. In fact, they've seen, in the last 6 months, they've seen a 20% increase from $300 a share up to today's dollar value, $370 trading per share. So I look at these data points and I'm kind of like, what does Spotify have figured out that these other brands don't have figured out? I have for a long time talked about effective leadership on the podcast. If you haven't listened to the podcast long term, in another life, the pre Good Advice days, I worked for a leadership consulting company. And we essentially did our consulting was all around effective leadership, motivating employees, retaining great talent, teaching managers how to effectively lead and get to the best outcome from their teams. So there's quite a bit that I learned from that gig and things that are absolutely still true today though today's leadership is much different back then. Back then, remote work was not a norm. There was no conversation about hybrid employees or anything of that sort. I remember the week before COVID, I gave a presentation to a business on remote work. And this was because the business had said, "Hey, would you be willing to come give a presentation on innovation in the workplace?" And I thought one of the most interesting points of innovation were businesses that were willing to have fully remote employees. Again, this was pre-COVID days, but I thought it was interesting that these businesses seemingly were able to manage effectively and to scale their businesses. And I think can't remember, maybe it was Zapier or what exactly which business it was, but I was talking. GitHub was one of them, but I was talking about billion-dollar businesses, billion with a B, that had entirely remote teams, and how I thought it was pretty interesting that these companies had found an answer for growing a business despite not having a corporate office that everyone was reporting to. So I gave this presentation like on a Tuesday. My daughter was born on a Saturday or Sunday. I don't remember what day of the week it was, honestly, but the very next week, COVID happened, everything shut down. That company called me back and said, "Hey," and they didn't really say like, "How did you know?" But they were like, "Hey, you gave a presentation on remote work. Like you were onto something. Can you come back and give another talk on managing remote work during COVID?" Which my response was, "Well, I don't really know that answer because I've never been through a worldwide pandemic before, but I can certainly come back." And there were actually a few different conversations I had with teams during that time on just leading effectively. So a bit of a weird, serendipitous chain of events, I guess. Though I guess it's a bit insensitive to call COVID serendipitous. Um, Obviously, a very tragic, traumatic time for many people, but a weird set of circumstances that got me back in front of some teams who, for whatever reason, saw me as a source of value talking through some of these concepts. And some of the things that I gave back then are still true today. That effective leadership really has nothing to do with being in the same office space as someone. What I will tell you, and I don't know if this stat is still true, but back when I was working at that consulting company, leadership consulting was one of the biggest expenses that corporate companies would spend in a given year. In fact, leadership consulting, paying for leadership development, was an industry that had grown exponentially over the last 30 or 40 years. We had customers who were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on our consulting services. So you can know this was not for many businesses, this is not a light expense. This is something that people take very seriously. And one of the biggest data points that was really interesting to me was, despite the investment of businesses, despite this growing substantially over the years, people were still quitting their jobs at greater rates than ever. You may remember a couple of years ago, we had something called the Great Resignation, a number which this was, by the way, grabbed by social media to talk about low wage earners who had had enough. And it was kind of like this obnoxious sort of political conversation on minimum wage and all of this stuff around people being entitled, I guess. What you can know is, statistically speaking, during the Great Resignation, these were not low wage earners who were quitting their jobs in mass. This was actually middle and senior leaders who were quitting their professions, who were ready for something different, who had had really enough of the corporate world that they were part of, and who had incredible resumes and had accomplished many great things. These were people who said, "You know what? I want something different." But point being, despite all the investments in leadership development, we still had people quitting their jobs at a greater rate than ever, which is pretty interesting. Gallup puts out a great, I think they used to do it annually. I think now they do it every 4 years, but it's called the State of the Workplace Report. In fact, I haven't checked on this in a long time. Let's see if there's one. Um, Here we go. Let's see if there's one here. This was 2023. So I actually haven't looked at this. And unfortunately, it looks like it's paywalled now. Let's see. This was something that I used to rely on pretty heavily. Okay, here we go. Key insights. This is what we care about. So, flipping through here. Now, back in the day, they talked about the number of employees who were quitting their companies. Looks like this is talking a lot about well being and loneliness. Okay, here's pretty interesting. Man, they've totally rechanged how they present the data here. I don't care about, well, I shouldn't say that. I was going to say, I don't care about well being. I do. It's a data point that I'm not looking for right now. Okay, maybe I'll come back to this later, where I'm not learning what this is saying as we're doing it. Let me just continue to click through here. It does say that companies that have happier employees make 23% more money, which, by the way, I think that's pretty obvious. And yet, so many business owners are out of tune of what makes their employees happy. Prior to this report, though, um, the previous ones, oh, here we go. Only 30% of managers and 23% of employees are actively engaged in their business. Now, what engagement refers to in Gallup's sense is people who like their job and look forward to coming to their job and who are actively engaged in the strategy of that job. They like the brand, they like contributing to that brand. So only 23% of employees feel that way. And on the flip side, and there's other categories here, but on the flip side, one of the things, the stats that they talked about is actively disengaged employees. And actively disengaged employees are employees who literally hate their jobs. They hate working for you. If they had a chance to leave and leave for less money, they would. In fact, they're usually often looking for that next job, and they're ready to jump at any given moment. Bottom line, uh, there is more than just like a kumbaya effect of good leadership where everyone's happy. It actually drives the bottom line revenue of your business. But despite all the money being put into leadership, we have people who are quitting their jobs more than ever. Part of that's also just the state of the times. It's easy. You have the gig economy. Someone can be a freelancer with relative ease, and it's just a different world today than it was, 30 years ago. But I think a lot about this, and I think about a story I have of a business owner I was talking to. This would have been this was pre-COVID. This would have been in the early days of Good Advice, probably maybe year one or year two, probably year two. I was talking to a business owner who ran a business. It was like an IT company, and he had 14 remote employees. And these employees, somewhere around there, these employees were local, but they were remote. So they, talked on Slack or what have you, but they were all based in that city. And I was talking to this business owner, and he goes, "Man, I'm just really anxious these days." And I said, "Okay, well, what's going on?" And he said, "Man, I'm about to prepare to take 2 weeks off to go around to all of my employees' home offices. And I'm just really stressed out because I really don't want to take 2 weeks off and yada yada." And I was like, "Okay, hang on, slow down. So what's going on? I don't really get it. Like you're gonna take 2 weeks off as the owner of the business to go around to each person's workstation, like each person's home. Why?" And he goes, "Oh, well, because I want to make sure that they are keeping their workstation tidy, that they've created a productive workspace." And what was funny about this too? He goes, "I'm also a little suspicious that some of them aren't really honoring what we agreed to for our business. They're not supposed to have kids in the home. So while they're working, they're not supposed to be actively parenting. and I want to kind of look around and see, are they dressed the way they're supposed to be when they report to work? Is the, are their kids present? All this kind of stuff. So I'm listening to him explain this, and I'm just like, this is pretty wild. But I didn't necessarily want to come straight. I didn't want to go straight for the kill in this moment. So I asked this question. I go, okay, so tell me, this is interesting. You're worried about your employees not doing things by the book, how you've set it up as remote employees. Tell me, what does revenue look like? And he goes, oh man, revenue is awesome. That's like the one consistent thing for our business. And I go, okay, well, tell me about that. Like, what revenue's up then? And he goes, oh my gosh, we've tripled our revenue in the last year. So I was hearing him talk about this, and I thought, man, you're worried that your employees are reporting to work in their underwear? And the advice I gave him was, I said, well, like, why are you so concerned about how your employees are dressing at home and what's happening at home? Like, why is that top of mind for you? And he said, well, I mean, that's how I'm supposed to manage, right? Like, how do I know they're doing what they're supposed to be doing? And I was like, well, first of all, they're not kids, you're not their parent. But second of all, you evaluate them based on the outcomes of what they're accomplishing for you. And if revenue has tripled, if they're wearing pajamas to work, I would say, hey, you got your lucky pajamas on. Please wear those every day because it's working. It's working for you. A lot of times, as business owners, as leaders, we don't know what good leadership looks like. We just know what's been told to us. And more often than not, though we know we shouldn't micromanage, the clearest form of leadership that we've seen is the boss who checks in on the employees, who makes sure, hey, you're doing what you should be doing. What did you do today? What did you accomplish today? And rather than seeing your employees as people you work hand in hand with to accomplish a common goal, an important goal, a goal that you could not do by yourself, that's why you hired people in the first place. Instead, we see it as this weird parental thing where I've given you a job, you should be grateful to me. And essentially, I'm going to be watching you carefully to make sure you're not taking advantage of me. It's very much from a place of distrust, and it doesn't make for great leadership. I think we live in a world where we have so much access to technology that we should be able to collaborate with employees anywhere in the world. Now, this isn't to say that every company should be fully remote. I have no problem with in person companies. I have no problem with hybrid companies, but I'll also say I have no problem with remote companies. I think that's probably obvious by now. I think all three businesses can work well so long as that is what's clear, so long as it's clear as to how that business operates from the get-go. Unfortunately, many managers, many leaders don't know how to lead. They only know how to check in. And this isn't always the leader's fault. There is a massive gap in leadership affinity. There's a massive gap in people who are given the skill set to be a great boss. You think of the story of the salesperson who is crushing it at sales. What does their boss do for them? Well, they promote them to the head of the sales team because clearly they know something about sales. The only problem is they don't know how to teach other people sales, or they don't know how to manage other people who are figuring out sales. And so what happens to that person? They typically crash and burn because they weren't given the skill set they needed to become an effective leader. And it's not always their fault. Sometimes it is the fault of the person who didn't set them up for success and give them the skill set that they needed to actually flourish and be a great boss. So I think there's many bosses out there who they genuinely want to be a great boss, but all they know to do is to knock on the door. Hey, what's going on? What are you working on? Do you need anything today? And to sort of be a bit of a scab on the day, a bit of this thing that keeps popping up, like, oh, what are you working on? What are you doing? Instead of taking charge and saying, you know what, here's the goal we need to accomplish. You, Brad, I don't know why Brad's the name in my head. Brad, here's your function. Here's what you're going to do. And then also, I think a lot of people have a weird haziness around using accountability to make sure that your employees are doing what they should be doing. Accountability in a lot of ways is seen as a naughty word. It's seen as a word of micromanaging. And accountability is not a bad term. In fact, some of the data at my previous consulting company that came out around effective teams was that people liked accountability and they liked peer to peer accountability, especially. They liked making sure that, hey, we're all on the right track. We're doing what we should be doing. It was something that people appreciated. But how it's often used are like these vague metrics, these weird, sometimes even not even a metric, but these anecdotal things. I had a friend of mine who worked for a boss who screamed at her because she had been on a phone call for too long with a customer. And apparently, like, phone calls aren't supposed to be more than a certain number of minutes. Now, is there any data around the amount of revenue you bring in based on how long the phone call is? Probably. Is it something that I would hang my entire business revenue strategy on? No, it wouldn't at all be what I'd hang my hat on. I would hang my hat on um, my salespeople knowing how to connect with their prospective customers, knowing how to build trust fast on a phone call, knowing how to validate if someone is a good fit for the business or not. There's lots of things that I would do way before I would ever ever talk about you need to make a certain number of phone calls per hour. But this is the low hanging fruit, right? All that to say, accountability is not a bad thing. And many business owners, many leaders don't understand the value of having simple metrics that guide the business. So sometimes the conversation that I get into when I work with business leaders and we talk about some of their producers, some of their salespeople, is someone will say, man, I'm having a hard time with this salesperson and I don't know what to do. Well, my question will typically be like, well, what is hard about it? What's the challenge? And I had someone actually tell me this. This would have been probably 4 or 5 years ago. But this guy was talking about one of his employees and he goes, yeah, well, he comes in at like 11 or 12 and then he like leaves at 2. And man, I don't know about that. And I was like, well, have you set an expectation of when the working hours are? Have you set an expectation of the things that need to get done in that time? Have you clarified to this employee why it's valuable for them to be in the office? And if you can't think of any reasons why it's valuable, then I would understand the employee being like, yeah, why am I here? I saw this funny video, not video, it was a picture of this person who posted, I think it was on Reddit or maybe it was on LinkedIn, but their business had called for a return from remote work back to in person. And this was like a global corporation. So this employee was a member, was basically lived in a location where they were the only one who was on this team in this one location. So this person posted a picture of, well, I'm reporting to work again today. And this person had made like a 30-minute commute into the city to this office building that was being leased. And it was literally just him. It was just his computer. But for the business, can't work at home. You gotta work. You gotta come into the office, so to speak. And you think about how this stuff gets so silly and the insanity around all of that. So all that to say, um, I really resonate with this leadership style from Spotify. And again, it's working for them. Our employees aren't children. Your employees aren't children. They're able to make smart decisions and strategic decisions and trustworthy decisions. And if they're not, why did you hire them? Why did you hire them if you couldn't trust them? If you couldn't trust that they were going to do a good job, if they were going to make the right decision, why would you hire them then? We hire people because of the affinities that they show us, the skill sets that they show us on the resume, on the interview, what have you. And amongst the sea of other people that you could have hired, you hired this person because they were a cut above the rest. And they may not have been the best person in the entire world for the position, but they were better than everyone else. So then why wouldn't we then treat them as such? Why wouldn't we then give that trust that they know what they're doing, or in the very least, empower them to grow in their profession and make even better decisions for the business? All that to say, if you disagree with this, I'm okay with that. Again, I have nothing wrong. I don't have really an issue with companies that aren't remote. It doesn't bother me. But what I will say is whenever I get into a conversation with a customer, with a client, and we don't see eye to eye, I always point to the outcomes of the business. I always point to revenue. When someone says, hey, I'm really big on this, this is what I'm doing, I typically ask, is that working? And if it's working, I'd say, okay, show me where it's working in the numbers. Show me the revenue. Show me how that is something actually there's a trail of breadcrumbs that show how this decision is promoting the business today, where it's not just a gut feeling, but we know it's working. And if they can't do that, then not to say like I was right, but those are the situations I press pretty hard on. And in a similar way, if you're listening and you're like, remote work doesn't work, seems to work for Spotify, seems to work for GitHub, a $1 billion business that was bought by Microsoft, and many other remote companies. Hey, that's today's Good Advice podcast episode. Thanks for tuning in today as we talk a little leadership. And if you're a first-time listener to the show, what the heck are you waiting on? Click the subscribe or follow button so you can keep getting good advice wherever you are. We bring great, tangible advice to you week after week. And I appreciate you listening to the show today. Thanks so much. We'll catch you later. See ya.